This is a medical facility, not a jungle. That's how arrogant Corpsman Mendez humiliated 78-year-old Doc Carver, mocking his old medical bag and forcing him to hide it in a locker. Mendez trusted only tablets and modern protocols. But his arrogance crumbled when an admiral collapsed in the waiting room. While the young man froze in panic, the useless old man acted. In just 12 seconds, using an improvised ballpoint pen, Doc saved the officer's life. The shock was total when a vice admiral walked in and revealed the truth. That old man was a legend who saved more lives with improvisation than Mendez would save with all the technology in the world. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. If this journey of valor touched you, consider subscribing to Silent Veterans and help us give a voice to more incredible stories of our silent veterans. Sir, you can't bring that in here. The voice belonged to Hospital Corpsman Jake Mendez, 27 years old, and convinced that his tablet held every answer the Navy Medical Corps had ever needed. He stood blocking the entrance to the waiting room at the VA Medical Center in Norfolk, Virginia, one hand on his hip, the other pointing at the canvas bag in the old man's weathered hands. Thomas Carver, 78 years old and bent like a question mark from decades of carrying weight no man should carry, looked up slowly. His eyes were the pale blue of winter ice, and they held a depth that Mendez didn't bother to notice. "It's just my kit," Doc said quietly, his voice roughened by age and cigarettes he'd quit 30 years too late. "Your kit." Mendez let out a short laugh that made two young Marines in the waiting room look up from their phones. "Oh, sir, this is a medical facility. We have actual medical equipment. You can't just walk around with a bag full of whatever that is." Doc's fingers tightened slightly on the worn canvas, a motion so subtle it might have been a tremor from age. The bag was older than Mendez, its olive drab fabric stained with things that didn't wash out. Inside were items that would look like junk to anyone who'd never had to save a life with nothing but improvisation and 12 seconds of clarity. A ballpoint pen with the ink cartridge removed, a roll of heavy-duty tape gone sticky at the edges, a razor blade wrapped in gauze, a length of rubber tubing. "I'll keep it with me," Doc said. "I won't bother anyone. It bothers me." Mendez stepped closer, his voice dropping to that particular tone of condescension that young men use when they think they're being patient. "Look, Pops, I get it. You probably carried this around in whatever war you were in. Vietnam's, right? But things have changed. We have protocols now, standards. You're in a modern facility, not a jungle." The waiting room had gone quiet. A dozen people, most of them veterans decades younger than Doc, watched the exchange with varying degrees of interest and discomfort. A young woman with sergeant stripes on her ACUs shifted in her seat. An older man with a Vietnam veteran cap pulled low, frowned but said nothing. Doc didn't argue. He'd learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth the breath. Where should I put it? "There's lockers by the entrance. You can pick it up when you leave." Mendez's tone had shifted to barely concealed impatience. "Unless you want to just leave it in your car like a normal person." "Don't have a car." "Took the bus." Mendez sighed theatrically, glancing at his tablet as if it might offer an escape from this conversation. "Fine, lockers. Now, we have actual patients who need attention, and you're holding up the line." There was no line. The waiting room was half empty, and the front desk clerk, a heavy-set woman named Doris who'd worked there for 20 years, was reading a paperback novel. But Doc didn't point that out. He just shuffled past Mendez, moving with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees had filed for retirement a decade ago. As he walked toward the bank of scratched metal lockers near the men's room, he heard Mendez mutter to one of the Marines, "Every day with these old-timers. Think they're special because they're veterans. This is a VA hospital. Everyone here served. Doesn't mean you get to break the rules." The Marine, a lance corporal with a fresh haircut and the lean build of someone who still ran 3 miles before breakfast, nodded uncertainly. He watched Doc fumble with the locker combination, those trembling hands betraying him, and something uncomfortable twisted in his gut. His grandfather had hands like that, had carried himself with that same quiet defeat, that sense of being tolerated rather than respected. Doc finally got the locker open and carefully placed his kit inside. He stared at it for a long moment, as if saying goodbye to an old friend, then closed the door with a soft metallic click. When he turned back toward the waiting room, Mendez had already moved on, absorbed in his tablet, swiping through digital charts with the confidence of a man who'd never had to make a life-or-death decision without the backing of an entire hospital's resources. The morning dragged on with the particular tedium unique to military medical facilities. Doc sat in a chair near the back, his appointment not for another 45 minutes, watching the flow of people. Young veterans with invisible wounds, middle-aged men with missing limbs, a handful of elderly warriors like himself, the survivors of wars that were now just chapters in history books that high school students barely read. Mendez worked the room like it was his personal kingdom, clipboard in one hand, tablet in the other, calling out names with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. When he called Thomas Carver and Doc slowly rose to his feet, Mendez barely looked up. "You're early. Sit back down. I'll call you when we're ready." "Thought I heard my name." "You did. I'm checking you in. Your appointment's at 1100. It's 10:15. Mendez's fingers danced across his tablet screen. "You have your ID card?" Doc produced it from a worn leather wallet. The card creased and faded. Mendez scanned it with a reader, frowned at whatever came up on his screen, and handed it back without comment. "Sit down. Stay awake this time. Last month I had to shake you 3 times before you heard your name." A flush of embarrassment colored Doc's weathered cheeks. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. I work for a living." It was an old military joke, but Mendez delivered it with an edge that stripped away any humor. He was already moving on to the next patient, a young woman with a service dog, and Doc shuffled back to his seat. The lance corporal who'd witnessed the earlier exchange found himself watching the old man. There was something about the way Doc moved, a precision buried under all that age and arthritis, like a finely made watch that had been dropped too many times but still kept perfect time if you knew how to read it. The young Marine thought about his grandfather again, about the stories the old man had told before dementia took his words. Stories about helicopters and rice paddies and friends who'd died with their boots on. He wondered if this old guy had stories like that, locked up behind those pale blue eyes. At 10:47, 3 minutes before Doc's scheduled appointment, the main doors opened and a man in his late 60s walked in. He wore a well-tailored civilian suit that couldn't quite hide the military bearing in his posture, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing chronic pain. His name was James Thornton, retired Rear Admiral, 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in the First Gulf War, and enough ribbons to fill a shadow box. He was at the VA for a routine cardiology follow-up, a consequence of too many years of stress and too many cigarettes in places where death came from the sky. Thornton checked in at the desk, exchanged a few words with Doris that made her laugh, and took a seat near the center of the room. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through emails, his reading glasses perched on his nose, unaware that he had less than 3 minutes to live. At 10:49, Thornton's phone slipped from his fingers and clattered on the linoleum floor. His hand went to his chest, clutching at his tie. His face went from healthy pink to ash gray in the span of a single breath, and then he pitched forward out of his chair, his body hitting the ground with the terrible weight of dead mass. For exactly 2 seconds, the waiting room froze in that uniquely human moment of disbelief, where the mind struggles to reconcile what the eyes are seeing with what reality should be. Then chaos erupted. Someone screamed. The lance corporal jumped to his feet. The woman with the service dog gasped, and Mendez, standing 15 feet away with his tablet in his hands, looked up with an expression of pure shock. "Oh my God," someone said. "He's not breathing." Mendez's training kicked in, but it kicked in through layers of procedure and protocol. His fingers flew to his tablet, pulling up emergency response procedures, his other hand reaching for the phone on the desk to call for a code. His mouth opened to shout for help, to follow the chain of command, to do exactly what the manual said to do. He had time. He had resources. He had every advantage. What he didn't have was 12 seconds of certainty. Thomas Carver moved like water. One moment he was in his chair at the back of the room, apparently half asleep, and the next he was dropping to his knees beside Thornton with a speed that defied every one of his 78 years. His hands, those trembling arthritic hands that had fumbled with a locker combination 10 minutes ago, suddenly moved with surgical precision. He rolled Thornton onto his back, tilted his head, checked the airway with 2 fingers that knew exactly what they were looking for. His other hand went to the carotid, counting beats that weren't there. 12 seconds. That was all he had before the math turned brutal. Before lack of oxygen started killing brain cells by the thousands. Before Admiral James Thornton became a statistic instead of a man going home to his grandchildren. The moment Doc's fingers touched Thornton's throat, searching for a pulse that was barely there, the sterile waiting room of the VA Medical Center dissolved like smoke. The fluorescent lights became the harsh white sun of Southeast Asia. The smell of industrial cleaner became the copper stink of blood and the acrid bite of cordite. And Doc wasn't 78 anymore. He was 19, belly down in the red mud of Khe Sanh, and the Marine Corps was teaching him the most important lesson he'd ever learn. When you have 12 seconds, you don't think, you move. January 21st, 1968. The siege of Khe Sanh was 6 days old, and the North Vietnamese artillery was turning the combat base into hell on earth. The mortars came in waves, the shriek of incoming rounds so constant that men stopped flinching and started calculating trajectories by pure instinct. Doc was attached to 1st Battalion, 26th Marines, a Navy corpsman in a sea of jarheads, and he'd already learned that his job description was simple: keep them alive or die trying. The round that changed everything landed 30 yards from the fighting hole where Lance Corporal Eddie Morrison and 3 other Marines were hunkered down. The explosion was close enough to shower them with dirt and shrapnel, far enough away that it shouldn't have killed anyone. But shrapnel doesn't care about should. A jagged piece of metal the size of a cigarette lighter punched through Morrison's flak jacket and into his chest cavity, collapsing his left lung and filling the space with blood. "Corpsman up! Corpsman up!" The scream cut through the bombardment, and Doc was running before his mind had fully processed the words. His feet found purchase in mud churned by constant shelling, his medical bag bouncing against his hip, his hands already reaching for the supplies he'd need. When he slid into the fighting hole, Morrison was on his back, his face going from red to blue, his mouth opening and closing like a fish drowning in air. Tension pneumothorax, hemothorax. Lung collapsed, chest cavity filling with blood, pressure building, heart being squeezed by the weight of Morrison's own fluid. Textbook said to start an IV, establish airway, call for medevac, transport to surgical unit. Textbook assumed you had time and backup and equipment. Doc had 12 seconds and a ballpoint pen. He tore open Morrison's uniforms, exposing the entry wound. Blood bubbled from it with each attempted breath, a sucking chest wound. Standard procedure: seal it. But there was no time for standard. The pressure in Morrison's chest was crushing his heart. Doc could see it in the distended neck veins, the way Morrison's eyes were starting to roll back. Another mortar screamed overhead, close enough that everyone ducked except Doc. His hands didn't even twitch. He grabbed the pen from his pocket, a cheap BIC that he'd been carrying since basic Mao, the ink long since used up, and broke it apart with a sharp crack. The plastic tube that remained was hollow, about the diameter of a drinking straw. "Hold him." Doc's voice was ice. 2 Marines grabbed Morrison's shoulders. Doc didn't wait for permission or consent or anything else. His fingers found the space between Morrison's ribs, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly where the anatomy textbook said it should be, and he made a 1-inch incision with the razor blade he kept in his kit. Then he shoved the pen tube through the incision and into Morrison's chest cavity. There was a sound like a tire deflating, a hiss of trapped air and blood escaping through the improvised chest tube. Morrison's face went from blue to gray to pink in the span of 3 seconds. His lungs expanded, his eyes focused. He took a breath that didn't sound like drowning. 12 seconds. That's how long it had taken from the moment Doc saw Morrison's face to the moment Morrison started breathing again. 12 seconds to decide that the textbook could go to hell, that improvisation wasn't just acceptable but mandatory, that sometimes the only thing separating life from death was the willingness to move when everyone else was frozen. Doc sealed the wound around the makeshift tube with heavy tape, started an IV, got fluids running. Morrison would need surgery, would need to be medevaced out, would need 6 months of recovery, but he would live. He would go home to Mobile, Alabama, would marry his high school sweetheart, would tell his grandkids about the crazy Navy corpsman who saved his life with a ballpoint pen. As the medevac Huey lifted Morrison out of Khe Sanh 3 hours later, the young Marine grabbed Doc's hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone who'd been dying that morning. His voice was hoarse from the tube they'd put down his throat. "Don't matter what happens next, Doc. You saved my life. I owe you everything." Doc just shook his head. "You don't owe me nothing. Just don't waste it." 3 weeks later, Morrison's personal effects were sent back from the field hospital in Da Nang. Inside was the canvas bag, carefully packed with the pen tube that had saved his life, the razor blade, a roll of tape, and a note in shaky handwriting. For the next 12 seconds. Eddie Morrison, LCPL, USMC. Doc carried that bag for the next 56 years. Through the rest of Vietnam. Through a brief retirement that felt wrong. Through a contract position in Desert Storm. Through a decade of working security at military bases. Through another deployment as a civilian contractor in Fallujah, where the 12 seconds came again and again, each time with different faces but the same desperate math. And when he finally retired for real, when his knees gave out and his hands started shaking and the VA became his social club, he still carried the bag, because you never knew when 12 seconds would matter. The waiting room at Norfolk snapped back into focus. Doc's hands had moved through the muscle memory without conscious thought. Thornton's airway was clear. He'd been choking on his own tongue. Doc had swept it clear with 2 fingers while simultaneously delivering a precordial thump to the chest. An old technique that most modern protocols had abandoned, but that still worked when the heart needed an electrical reset. Thornton gasped, coughed, drew in a ragged breath. His eyes fluttered open, confused and terrified. "Don't move," Doc said quietly, his hands already checking pulse, respiration, pupil response. "You're okay. Stay still." Mendez finally snapped out of his paralysis, dropping his tablet and rushing over. How did you? His training reasserted itself. "Sir, step back. I need to assess the patient." Doc didn't move. His fingers were on Thornton's wrist, counting heartbeats. Pulse is weak but steady. Respiratory rate elevated. Possible cardiac event complicated by airway obstruction. "He needs transport now." "I know what he needs," Mendez said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was staring at Doc's hands, at the way they moved with absolute certainty, at the way this old man who'd been fumbling with a locker combination was suddenly the calmest person in the room. "I called for an ambulance. They're 3 minutes out." "Good." Doc started to move back, to give Mendez space, but Thornton's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "You," Thornton rasped, his voice barely audible. "I know you." Doc met his eyes and saw the flicker of recognition there, the way memories work when they're buried deep but never really gone. "No, sir. Just someone who was here." "You are. I know your face." Thornton's grip tightened. His eyes were clearing now, the fog of near-death lifting. "Where? When? Doesn't matter. You need to rest." "Fallujah." Thornton's voice was gaining strength, memory clicking into place like tumblers in a lock. 2004. Second Battle of Fallujah. "You were with the contractors, the civilian medical team." His eyes widened. "You're the one who pulled me out of that building when the IED went off. You and that bag of yours." The room had gone silent. Everyone was watching now, the drama of the medical emergency giving way to something else, some story unfolding in real time. Doc tried to pull his hand away, but Thornton held on. "Sir, you need to focus on breathing." "You had a ballpoint pen," Thornton said, and there was wonder in his voice now, the kind of wonder that comes when you realize the universe has a sense of timing. "I was pinned under rubble, sucking chest wound. You did something with a pen and saved my life. I tried to find you after. No one knew your name. They just called you Doc." Mendez was staring at Doc now, his earlier condescension replaced by something like shock. "You were a contractor in Fallujah." "A long time ago." "He was more than a contractor," Thornton said. His breathing was easier now, color returning to his face. "He was a ghost. Showed up where the fighting was worst, patched people up, disappeared before anyone could thank him." He looked at Mendez. "Son, Do you have any idea who you've been talking to? Mendez opened his mouth, but nothing came out. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder. The ambulance was close. But the tension in the room had shifted, had taken on a different quality. The lance corporal who'd been watching Doc all morning stood up, unconsciously coming to attention. The woman with the service dog had tears running down her cheeks, and Doris at the front desk had put down her paperback, her hand over her mouth. The main entrance doors burst open, and a team of EMTs rushed in with a stretcher and medical gear. But right behind them, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who owned whatever space he entered, came a man in a Navy officer's uniform. 3 stars gleamed on his shoulder boards. Vice Admiral Richard Hale, commander of Navy Medicine East Iran, had been on the floor above conducting an inspection tour of the facility when the code had been called. He'd responded out of instinct and command responsibility, expecting to find his staff handling a routine medical emergency. What he found was Thomas Carver kneeling on the floor, his weathered hand still on Admiral Thornton's wrist, and the entire waiting room watching in stunned silence. Hale stopped dead in his tracks. His face went through a series of rapid transformations: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally something like joy mixed with profound respect. "Holy God," he said softly. "Doc Carver." Mendez looked up at the Vice Admiral, then back at Doc, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "Admiral, I have the situation under control. This civilian, Hale said, his voice cutting through Mendez's words like a scalpel, has more medical experience than everyone in this building combined." He walked over to Doc, ignoring protocol, ignoring the EMTs who were starting to load Thornton onto the stretcher, ignoring everything except the old man on the floor. "Tom, it's been what? 15 years. About that, sir." Doc slowly got to his feet, his knees protesting, and Hale reached out to steady him. "Don't sir me. You outrank me where it matters." Hale turned to face the room, his command voice filling the space. "For those of you who don't know, which appears to be almost everyone, you have been in the presence of a legend. Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Carver, retired. 3 tours in Vietnam as a Navy corpsman with the Marines. 2 tours in the First Gulf War. Multiple deployments as a civilian contractor in Iraq and Afghanistan. The man who the Special Operations community calls the 12-second saint." Mendez felt his stomach drop. "The what?" "The 12-second saint," Hale repeated. "Because that's how long it took him to assess a casualty and start treatment. Not a minute, not 30 seconds. 12 seconds from the moment he touched a wounded man to the moment he had that man stabilized. Doesn't matter if it was a sucking chest wound, a severed artery, a tension pneumothorax. 12 seconds, every single time." Hale's eyes swept the room, landing on each person, making sure they understood. "In Vietnam, Chief Carver saved 47 lives that are documented. In Iraq and Afghanistan, probably double that. But no one kept count because he was a contractor, and the military doesn't like to admit how much they need civilians." He looked at Mendez. "The kit you made him lock up, that kit has saved more lives than this entire facility will save this year. Each piece in there represents someone who lived because Tom Carver refused to believe that equipment limitations meant death." The EMTs had Thornton on the stretcher now, but they'd paused at listening. One of them, an older man with gray in his beard, was staring at Doc with open reverence. "I've heard the stories," he said quietly. "Thought they were myths. The corpsman who could use anything as medical equipment. The guy who did a tracheotomy with a pocket knife and a coffee stirrer. That was you." Doc looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Just did what needed doing." "No," Hale said firmly. "You did what no one else could do. There's a difference." He turned to Mendez, and his voice dropped to a register that made the young corpsman want to sink through the floor. "Petty Officer Mendez, do you understand what you did this morning? Do you have any comprehension of the magnitude of your disrespect?" Mendez's face had gone pale. "Admiral, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't. Because you assumed. You saw an old man with a bag of junk, and you assumed he was just another confused veteran wasting your precious time." Hale's voice was ice. "You know what happens when you assume in combat medicine? People die. Every person you dismissed, every veteran you treated like an inconvenience. They're here because they served, And some of them, like Chief Carver, did things that you with all your tablets and protocols will never be capable of. The Vice Admiral let that sink in, watching Mendez squirm. Then he turned back to Doc, and his expression softened. Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to say yes. I'm retired, Rich. I know, but we need you. Hale gestured around the room. These kids, they're good. They're well trained. But they're trained for modern facilities with modern equipment. You know what happens when that equipment fails? When they're in a field hospital in some godforsaken place where the power goes out and the supply line gets cut. They freeze. Because no one's teaching them how to improvise. No one's teaching them the old ways. Doc shook his head. Wait, I'm too old to teach. You just saved Admiral Thornton's life with your bare hands and 60-year-old muscle memory. You're not too old for anything. Hale's voice took on a tone of command. I want you to develop a training program, something we can implement across all Navy medical facilities. Combat medicine with improvised equipment, the techniques they used in Vietnam, in Korea, in World War II. The stuff that's been lost because we got too dependent on technology. That's a young man's job. It's an experienced man's job. I'll get you whatever support you need. Assistance, resources. Just teach these kids what you know, before it's lost forever. Hale glanced at Mendez. And your first student is going to be Petty Officer Mendez here. Consider it part of his continuing education. Mendez looked like he'd been punched. Admiral, yes, sir. The EMTs were rolling Thornton toward the door now, but the retired admiral managed to raise a hand, gesturing for Doc to come closer. When Doc did, Thornton's voice was rough with emotion. I never got to thank you. In Fallujah. You were gone before I woke up. Didn't need thanks, just needed you to live. Well, I did. 20 more years. Got to see my grandkids grow up. Got to retire with my wife on a beach in Florida. Got to live a life I never would have had. Thornton's eyes were bright with tears. Thank you. For all those years. For today. For everything. Doc just nodded, his throat tight. The EMTs wheeled Thornton out, and the waiting room slowly started to return to normal. Though normal had shifted into something new. People were looking at Doc differently now. Not as an old man taking up space, but as someone who mattered. Someone who'd earned his place. Hale put a hand on Doc's shoulder. I mean it about the training program, the Carver Protocol. We'll call it that. Make it official. You don't need to name it after me. Yes, I do. Because when these young corpsmen and medics are out there and the situation goes sideways, I want them to remember that someone before them faced worse with less, and still saved lives. I want them to carry your example with them. Over the next 6 months, Thomas Carver became a fixture at the VA Medical Center in Norfolk. 3 times a week, he taught classes on field expedient medicine to corpsmen, medics, and civilian contractors heading overseas. He taught them how to do a chest decompression with a ballpoint pen, how to control hemorrhaging with a tourniquet made from a belt, how to intubate with a coffee stirrer when a proper tube wasn't available. He taught them that improvisation wasn't a last resort, it was a survival skill. Jake Mendez became Doc's shadow. The arrogance burned away in the first week, replaced by a humility that came from realizing how much he didn't know. He learned to see with his hands, to assess with touch rather than technology. He learned that every second counted, and that 12 seconds of certainty beat a minute of hesitation every time. The Carver Protocol was officially adopted by Navy medicine in August. By December, it had spread to Army and Air Force medical training. Within 2 years, it was taught at every military medical school in the country, a bridge between the old ways and the new. A reminder that technology was a tool but experience was wisdom. On a Tuesday afternoon in March, and almost a year after the incident in the waiting room, Doc was sitting in his usual chair, waiting for a routine appointment. His kit was on his lap now, no one questioned it anymore. Mendez walked past, saw him, and stopped. Without a word, the young corpsman pulled up a chair and sat down beside the old man. Got a question for you, Doc, Mendez said. Shoot. Last week, we had a situation, multi-vehicle accident on I-64. By the time we got there, we had 3 critical patients and not enough equipment. I had to improvise. Mendez's voice was quiet, almost reverent. There was a guy with a collapsed lung. I remembered what you taught us. Used a pen. Saved his life. Doc nodded slowly. Good. He asked me my name. Wanted to know who saved him. Mendez looked at Doc. I told him it wasn't me. Told him it was someone who taught me that 12 seconds can change everything. Told him about you. Didn't need to do that. Yeah, I did. Mendez reached into his pocket and pulled out a small canvas pouch. New but made in the same style as Doc's ancient kit. I made this. Put together my own field kit. Figured if I'm going to carry your lessons, I should carry your example too. Doc looked at the pouch, at the care that had gone into it, at what it represented. That's good, son. Real good. They sat in silence for a moment, two corpsmen separated by 50 years and connected by the same truth. That in the worst moments, when everything goes wrong, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall back on your training. And if your training includes the wisdom of those who came before, who faced worse with less and still saved lives, then maybe you have a chance. When Doc's name was finally called, Mendez stood up with him. Need any help, Doc? I got it. I know you do. Mendez smiled. But I'm here if you need me. Like you were there for all of us. Doc nodded, shouldered his kit, and walked toward the exam rooms with the careful deliberation of a man whose knees filed for retirement years ago but whose purpose never would. Behind him, the waiting room continued its usual rhythm. But everyone there knew something now that they hadn't known before. That heroes don't always announce themselves, that legends can look like ordinary old men, and that sometimes the most important 12 seconds of your life are the ones where someone else refused to give up on you. If you were moved by Doc Carver's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, please like this video, share it with someone who respects our veterans, and subscribe to Silent Veterans for more stories of the unassuming heroes who walk among us.